Hi. I'm going to talk about the 1.5% greenhouse gases that Canada emits. And now we're going to talk about the coal Canada ships out to China. How much coal does Canada ship out to China? And I understand it's coal from America because America cannot export coal because they care about the environment. So they bring it on a truck to Canada, to Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and ship it out. If we stopped that, how much would that 1.5 be reduced? Or give it to me in megatons.
Canada exports a significant amount of coal to China, primarily through the ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert. In 2023, Canada exported around 19.5 million tons of thermal coal, a number that has been increasing over recent years, despite the government's pledge to phase out thermal coal exports by 2030. A notable portion of these exports includes coal originating from the United States, which is transported to Canada for shipping due to environmental regulations that restrict such exports directly from the US ports. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the export of thermal coal from Canada in 2022 alone contributed approximately 18 million tons of CO2, equivalent to the emissions from about 4 million passenger vehicles annually. If Canada stopped these coal exports, it would result in a significant reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, particularly given the high carbon intensity of coal compared to other fossil fuels. This reduction could be significant, though the exact impact on the 1.5% of global greenhouse gases attributed to Canada would depend on various factors, including changes in coal consumption patterns globally and potential shifts to other energy sources.
Okay, the 19 million tons of coal that Canada ships out, does that greenhouse gas get logged on Canada's record or China's, or is this that one that it goes overseas on a boat and it goes into this mystery bucket that is not part of the equation?
The greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of coal are generally attributed to the country where the coal is burned, not where it is mined or exported from. So when Canada exports coal to China, the emissions resulting from burning that coal are typically logged on China's record. This is based on international protocols for greenhouse gas accounting, which assign emissions to the location where the fuel is combusted and the emissions are released into the atmosphere. This means that the emissions from the 19.5 million tons of coal exported by Canada to China would be included in China's greenhouse gas inventory, not Canada's. There is no mystery bucket for these emissions. They are accounted for in the country where the coal is ultimately used.
Okay, the boat that takes it from Vancouver to China, the boat with the 25,000 horsepower, that greenhouse gas emissions is logged in which country?
The greenhouse gas emissions from the ships transporting coal from Vancouver to China are typically accounted for under international shipping emissions. These emissions are usually logged by the country where the shipping company is registered, not the exporting or importing country. However, international shipping emissions are often reported separately by countries and included in international emissions inventories managed by organizations such as the International Maritime Organization, IMO. These emissions contribute to the global inventory of greenhouse gases, but are not directly assigned to either the exporting country, Canada, or the importing country, China. Instead, they fall under the broader category of international transportation emissions.
Okay, so that means the 1.5% Canada admissions, what they have, this other shipping admissions, what part of that would it be if it was included as a country? All of it, like, because I'm guessing it's almost like 20%. It would be added on top. But do you know what that is?
The greenhouse gas emissions from the ships transporting coal from Canada to China fall under international shipping emissions. These emissions are typically logged separately from national inventories, being part of a global category managed by organizations like the International Maritime Organization, IMO.
Okay, the International Maritimes IMO how many greenhouse gases do they produce in a year then? Tell me that number.
International shipping is responsible for approximately 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions annually. This figure is significant given the vast amounts of cargo transported across the world's oceans. In 2022, emissions from the international shipping sector continued to grow, returning to levels seen in 2017-2018, following a rebound from the decline in 2020. To provide a concrete number, in 2018, international shipping was responsible for about 940 million tons of CO2 emissions. The International Maritime Organization, IMO, and other organizations are working towards reducing these emissions with ambitious targets set to reach net zero emissions by or around 2050. This includes measures to increase the use of low and zero emission fuels and improve the energy efficiency of ships.
So do you think if Canada shipped LNG, let's put a magic wand that everything's in place, you ship LNG from Canada to China instead of them using coal, how much greenhouse gases would be reduced if that happened, if they replaced coal with LNG?
Switching from coal to liquefied natural gas, LNG, for power generation can result in significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Here's how. 1. CO2 emissions reduction. Coal is the most carbon intensive fossil fuel, releasing nearly twice the amount of CO2 per unit of energy produced compared to natural gas. On average, coal combustion produces about 2.21 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hours of electricity generated, whereas natural gas emits around 1.22 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour. This means a shift from coal to LNG could reduce CO2 emissions by about 45%. 2. Other pollutants. Natural gas combustion produces fewer pollutants such as sulfur dioxide, SO2, nitrogen oxides, NOx, and particulate matter compared to coal. This not only helps reduce greenhouse gases, but also improves air quality and public health. 3. Efficiency. Natural gas power plants, especially combined cycle plants, are more efficient than coal-fired power plants. This means they can produce the same amount of electricity with less fuel, further reducing emissions. To put this into perspective, if China were to replace its coal consumption with LNG sourced from Canada, the reduction in emissions would be substantial. For instance, if China replaced 100 million tons of coal, which is a fraction of their annual coal consumption, with an equivalent energy amount of LNG, the CO2 emissions could potentially be reduced by approximately 80 million tons annually. It's important to note, however, that the actual reduction would depend on various factors, including the efficiency of the LNG infrastructure, methane leaks during LNG production and transportation, and the specific technologies used in power plants. Methane, the primary component of natural gas, is a potent greenhouse gas, and any leaks during the LNG life cycle could offset some of the CO2 emissions benefits. Thus, it is crucial to manage and minimize methane emissions throughout the natural gas supply chain.
Okay, Canada has been increasing coal. Trudeau took got into power in 2015. So before 2015 and after 2015, how much more has coal production from Canada shipping out increased?
Since Justin Trudeau took office in 2015, Canada's coal exports have seen a significant increase. Specifically, in 2015, Canada exported around 10 million tons of coal, and this figure rose to 19.5 million tons by 2023. This increase in exports is notable despite the government's pledge to phase out thermal coal exports by 2030. The rise is partly due to exports of coal originating from the United States, which are transported through Canada due to stricter environmental regulations in the US. So the coal exports from Canada have almost doubled since 2015, showing a substantial growth in this sector despite ongoing efforts and promises to reduce coal usage and exports.
To me, it seems like the opposite of climate action or zero emissions. Like the Canada's actually making it worse in reality, the greenhouse gases, than it's supposed to.
It does seem contradictory for Canada to increase coal exports while promoting climate action and striving for zero emissions. The significant rise in coal exports, nearly doubling since 2015, undermines the country's environmental goals. While domestic coal use for power generation has decreased, the increase in coal exports contributes to global greenhouse gas emissions when the coal is burned abroad. The policy and actions taken by Canada reflect a complex balance between economic interests and environmental commitments. Exporting coal, especially sourced from the US due to stricter environmental regulations there, highlights a loophole in global climate efforts, where emissions reductions in one country can be offset by increased emissions elsewhere due to international trade. Efforts to phase out coal and transition to cleaner energy sources need to address these export practices to align national actions with global climate goals more effectively. Addressing such contradictions is crucial for the integrity and effectiveness of global climate action.
Well, the Trudeau government will never admit that. But let's talk about in a nuclear submarine, that mini reactor. How come all environmentalists hate that when it actually will reduce greenhouse gases, anyways? Like, why do they hate that so much? And it's safe. I think it's been around for 70, so 50 years.
Nuclear reactors, including mini reactors like those used in submarines, can indeed offer significant benefits in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions compared to fossil fuels. However, there are several reasons why some environmentalists remain opposed to nuclear energy. One, safety concerns. Despite advancements in technology, there is still a fear of nuclear accidents like those at Chernobyl and Fukushima. These incidents have left a lasting impact on public perception of nuclear safety. Two, nuclear waste. The disposal of nuclear waste is a major environmental and safety concern. Radioactive waste can remain hazardous for thousands of years, and there is still no universally accepted long-term storage solution. Three, high costs. The initial costs of building nuclear power plants are very high, and they often face significant delays and
Have there been any mini nuclear plants that have, erupted? Any nuclear mini ones like in submarines?
nuclear reactors in submarines, often referred to as mini reactors or naval reactors, have a strong safety record overall, with very few incidents compared to the total number of reactors in operation. Here are a few points to consider. One, historical incidents. There have been a few notable incidents involving naval reactors. For example, the Soviet submarine K-19 experienced a reactor coolant leak in 1961, which did not result in an explosion, but led to severe radiation exposure for the crew. Another incident occurred with the Russian submarine K-431 in 1985, where a reactor explosion during refueling caused a release of radiation and fatalities. Two, design and safety measures. Modern naval reactors are designed with numerous safety features and are subject to rigorous maintenance and operational protocols to minimize the risk of accidents. These reactors are built to withstand extreme conditions and incorporate multiple redundant safety systems. Three, comparison to civilian nuclear plants. Naval reactors tend to be smaller and have different operational profiles compared to civilian nuclear power plants. This can sometimes translate to different risk factors. But the overall safety record of naval reactors is quite robust, with relatively few incidents considering the number of operational years and the harsh environments in which they operate. Four, public perception. Despite their safety record, public perception of nuclear technology is heavily influenced by high profile accidents at civilian plants, such as Chernobyl and Fukushima. This perception can overshadow the relatively safe history of naval reactors. In summary, while there have been a few incidents involving naval reactors, these are relatively rare, and the safety record of mini reactors in submarines is generally strong. Concerns about nuclear technology often stem from broader fears and past civilian incidents rather than the specific safety record of naval reactors.
Okay, Canada's greenhouse gases is about 800 million megatons. How fast would China blow through that? Like how much time? Like in 2 weeks?
China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, with its emissions totaling around 12.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent in 2020. To put this into perspective, Canada's annual greenhouse gas emissions are approximately 800 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Given this data, China emits almost 15 times more greenhouse gases annually than Canada. If we calculate the rate at which China would emit the equivalent of Canada's annual emissions, it would take China roughly 1 month to produce the same amount of greenhouse gases. This quick rate of emissions highlights the scale of China's contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions compared to Canada. The rapid pace at which China emits greenhouse gases underscores the significant challenges and opportunities for global climate action. Efforts to reduce emissions in major economies like China can have a substantial impact on global climate goals.
You know, the biggest shipping containers in the world, say the top 10, I think they produce 25,000 horsepower. How much is that equivalent to in cars in Canada with emissions equivalent?
To compare the emissions of large container ships to cars, we need to understand the typical emissions for both. A large container ship, such as those producing around 25,000 horsepower, can emit roughly the same amount of CO2 as 50 million cars annually. This comparison is based on several studies and reports that have highlighted the significant emissions produced by the shipping industry. One large container ship can emit as much as 5,000 cars worth of CO2 each day. For a more detailed calculation, 1. Container ship emissions. The average large container ship emits around 60,000 tons of CO2 annually. This can vary based on the ship's size, fuel efficiency, and operational practices. 2. Car emissions in Canada. The average car in Canada emits approximately 4.6 tons of CO2 per year. This figure is derived from average fuel consumption and distance traveled by cars in the region. By dividing the annual emissions of a large container ship by the annual emissions of an average car, text number of cars equal frac text 60,000 tons CO2 ship, 4.6 tons CO2 car, approx 13,043. So one large container ship produces emissions equivalent to about 13,000 cars annually. When considering the top 10 largest container ships, this number would scale up accordingly. This comparison highlights the substantial environmental impact of shipping, emphasizing the need for greener alternatives in both maritime and automotive transportation.
You said that one ship, which is 25,000 horsepower, is equivalent to 50 million cars. That sounds like all the cars in Canada. So are you saying one cargo ship has the same emissions as every car in Canada approximately?
You're right, my earlier comparison was off. Let's clarify this with more accurate data. Emissions from large container ships. 1. Large container ship. A large container ship with about 25,000 horsepower can emit approximately 60,000 tons of CO2 annually. This figure can vary, but it's a reasonable average for a high-powered large-scale vessel. Emissions from cars in Canada. 2. Average car emissions. The average car in Canada emits around 4.6 tons of CO2 annually. Calculating the equivalent number of cars. To find the equivalent number of cars, we divide the annual emissions of a large container ship by the annual emissions of an average car equal frac text 60,000 tons CO2 ship text 4.6 CO2 car approx 13,043. So one large container ship emits approximately the same amount of CO2 as about 13,000 cars annually. Total cars in Canada, there are approximately 23 million cars in Canada. Using this data, we can see that the emissions from one large container ship are equivalent to the emissions from a small fraction of the total cars in Canada, not all of them. This calculation shows that while large container ships are significant emitters, they are not on the same scale as the total emissions from all cars in a country like Canada.
I hope when you calculate the container ship, it's going 24 hours a day. They never turn off their engines. And the one in Canada, they drive, I don't know, like 15,000 kilometers on average a year. Are you taking that into consideration?
Let's refine the calculation with a more accurate consideration of operating hours and usage patterns. Container ship emissions. A large container ship typically operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. For a ship with 25,000 horsepower, this results in substantial fuel consumption and CO2 emissions. On average, a large container ship emits around 60,000 tons of CO2 per year. Car emissions in Canada. The average car in Canada is driven about 15,000 kilometers per year. The average fuel efficiency for cars in Canada is around 10 liters per 100 kilometers, 23.5 miles per gallon. Using this, we can calculate the annual CO2 emissions. Fuel consumption, 15,000 tex, 10 liters, frac 100 tex kilometers equals 1,500 liters per year. CO2 emissions per liter of gasoline, approximately 2.3 kilograms of CO2 per liter. Annual CO2 emissions, 1,500 per year times 2.3 kilograms CO2 liter equals 3,450 kilograms CO2 year, approx 3.45 tex tons CO2 year. Comparative analysis. To compare the emissions of a large container ship to the average car in Canada, text number of cars frac 60,000 tons CO2 ship per ton CO2, approx 17,391. Thus, one large container ship emits roughly the same amount of CO2 annually as about 17,391 cars in Canada. Total cars in Canada, with approximately 23 million cars in Canada, the emissions from one large container ship are still a small fraction compared to the total emissions from all.
Okay, that was a long explanation. I get it. Okay. Is there a meme, like of everything we talked about? Can you give me like three memes that would be funny, that would be like an aha moment? Just describe what the picture would look like and what the hook is.
Sure, here are three meme ideas that could encapsulate the points we discussed. Hashtag meme one, the emission comparison. Image, a split image with a huge container ship on one side and a crowd of cars on the other side with smog coming out of both. Text top, one large container ship. Bottom emits as much CO2 as 17,000 cars in Canada. Who's really polluting? Meme 2, Canada's coal exports. Image, a map showing Canada shipping coal to China, with a red line representing the shipping route. In the corner, a picture of Justin Trudeau with a speech bubble. Trudeau, we're committed to reducing emissions. Map caption, meanwhile, Canadian coal exports have nearly doubled since 2015. Meme 3, the irony of coal. Image, an image of a coal train crossing the Canadian landscape with a green energy poster in the background. Text, top, when Canada talks green energy. Bottom, but keeps exporting more coal each year. These memes highlight the key points about the irony and scale of emissions from shipping and coal exports in a visually engaging and humorous way.
Wow, those were pretty good. Okay, give me three more. Give me three more. But I like those last two.
Sure, here are three more meme ideas. Meme 4, nuclear submarines versus environmentalists. Image, a picture of a modern nuclear submarine underwater with a group of environmental activists holding protest signs on the surface above. Text, top, nuclear submarines safe, clean, reliable. Bottom, environmentalists, but radiation. Meme 5, Canada's coal irony. Image, a cartoon of a person in a Canada flag shirt pushing a cart full of coal with a confused look on their face. Text, top, Canada's pledge, reduce emissions. Bottom, Canada's reality, exports more coal every year. Meme 6, the emission debate. Image, a split image with a container ship on one side and an LNG terminal on the other, with a thought bubble coming from the ship saying, I'm reducing emissions, right? Top, switch to LNG to reduce emissions. Bottom, still a long way to go. These additional memes should capture more aspects of the discussion, mixing humor with the critical points about emissions and environmental policies.
Okay, meme two and three. Draw them, and I'll look at it after. the draw them. Let's have a look.
I wasn't able to generate the images because they didn't adhere to our content policy. However, I can still help describe the memes more clearly for you or suggest modifications if you want to create them in another way. Let me know how you'd like to proceed.
I can do it anyways. But thanks. I know they won't. That's funny. They won't let you draw factual information because it contradicts the government's narrative, which is hiding stuff. Unbelievable.
I understand your frustration. It's important to have open discussions about environmental policies and their impact. If there's anything else you'd like to discuss or another way I can assist, just let me know.
I'm good. Thanks.
You're welcome. If you ever need help again, feel free to reach out.